Fight News Now Live continues. John Paula here alongside John Randine and Robin Black. Looking ahead to next Saturday night, the UFC is back on pay-per-view. UFC 187. It's not the card that we were originally anticipating, but they have plugged a number of holes. Daniel Cormier will now be fighting Anthony Johnson for the vacant light heavyweight championship, which still sounds bizarre to be saying. And then, of course, Chris Weidman defends his middleweight championship against Vitor Belfort. Let's start off at 205 pounds. Anthony Johnson had been preparing for arguably the best fighter in the world in Jon Jones. He's getting a very different stylistic opponent in Daniel Cormier, and I think it brings as many questions as it does answers. I think Cormier is a completely different fighter, but one that you can certainly say is a more competitive fight than Jones-Johnson was, in my estimation.
I love this fight. I think that you're talking about two of the three best 205-pound fighters in the world. And we went down to AKA in San Jose and we talked to Daniel Cormier, and he says, my goal is always to be facing, in my mind, I'm always facing off with the best guy in the world, being Jon Jones. He goes, once you have the number one guy covered, that takes care of number two all the way down to number 10. And he looks at Anthony Johnson the same way. I think, when Cain Velasquez, arguably the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world, is your teammate and training partner. And Cain says the reason he's had so much success is because Daniel Cormier has been pushing him, and Cain's getting ready for Fabrizio Verdum. I think Daniel Cormier is going to be on fire. He go back to the drawing board and say, hey, these are the things I couldn't execute against Jon Jones. It's not going to happen against Anthony Johnson, but Anthony Johnson, we've seen since his return to the UFC, just an animal on fire, that if he lands those hands on you, you are in big trouble. He can stop the takedowns. Will he be able to stop them from Daniel Cormier? And there you see, always calm and cool. And then he lets his hands fly inside of the cage. His confidence just seems to be higher than most.
When you look at the footage of Anthony Johnson, the thing to watch is not his hands, but his feet. He's a fairly misunderstood fighter. What makes him special is the way he moves his feet, where he is. When he was going up in weight and he went to Coach Henry after a loss and getting cut from the UFC, he said to Coach Henry Hooft, build me into the fighter. I'll do whatever I have to do to be the best fighter in the world. And they started with his stance. When you have the kind of power that this guy has, you need to have him in a position of balance to always be able to deliver that power. And with that balance comes incredible defensive abilities. Anthony Johnson, super underrated defensively. So I think people will be underrating him in this fight. Cormier is a monster, but don't underestimate Anthony Johnson in this one.
And with Jon Jones vacating his championship, a stick of dynamite has been placed into the 205-pound rankings, and here is the fallout from John Randine. There at the top of the list, Daniel Cormier, number 2, Anthony Johnson. So if you're John Randine, you can't get better than this when it comes to the two best available light heavyweights to determine who will take that championship belt.
I have to agree, and I mean...
Well, I'm glad you agree with yourself.
It's true. I mean, like, what are you going to do? Daniel Cormier, the only
guy...
the only guy to defeat Daniel Cormier, Jon Jones, and just the idea of having to suffer that loss. Daniel Cormier is one of these competitors that it drives him nuts when he loses. So I think we're going to see a very different Daniel Cormier in this fight against Anthony Johnson, who's going to have his hands full because a freight train's going to be coming his way. And I know what Robin says, you just got to move out of the way, but Cormier is going to follow that track.
Yeah, it's true.
Create his own track.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate that there's not another great fight on this, this card. Weidman versus Vitor. Are you kidding me? Finally, Chris Weidman has developed into, in my estimation, that true new breed. He's a super athlete. He's got his striking has developed really sublime. He has great movement, great strategy, powerful wrestling, and dominant ground game. He's the full package. And probably even more important than that is his mental strength. The dude is mentally a giant. And against Vitor, who he believes is mentally a little bit on the weaker side, and at times in his career he has shown that, you look for Chris to get super aggressive early, and this is going to be, in my opinion, a breakout performance for a guy who's already thought of as one of the best. You're going to see a whole other level out of Weidman.
On top of that, Chris Weidman doesn't have the miles that Vitor Belfort has. You look at this card, there's so many guys, including Donald Cerrone, that have spent so much time in the cage. And for Chris Weidman, he's such a ridiculous athlete. Robin says that he's so mentally strong, he knows how to go out there and do what he does best. And we saw that in the Lyoto Machida fight. But Vitor Belfort, when he is on, there against Luke Rockhold, or there's Michael Bisping, I mean, we saw Bisping, Rockhold, and Dan Henderson. Vitor Belfort, when that Vitor Belfort steps in the cage, and I don't know if we're going to see that. Well, I mean, he can end anybody's
Yeah,
match.
when you say when that Vitor is on, you mean on steroids, right? Or on testosterone. And that has been a knock against Vitor. He's failed a number of drug tests. There was the testosterone replacement therapy. He is a different fighter when he's not pumped full of testosterone, so we're going to have to see.
And we will see John Randine's rankings, that expert John Randine placing, obviously, Chris Weidman at the top of the 185-pound picture. And Vitor Belfort, number 2, which I am somewhat surprised because I don't see him at the level of Luke Rockhold, even Jacare. I think Vitor Belfort, it's too much of a question mark. It's been a long time since we've seen him in action. And this Saturday, not to overemphasize things, it's going to be a referendum on Vitor Belfort's career. I think a flat Vitor Belfort is kind of going to tell the tale of where this guy's career is going to go.
It's true, but you have to remember, no matter what, there's so many questions surrounding Vitor. He still knocked out Luke Rockhold. Rockhold beat Jacare. So when you're using MMA math, Vitor is still ahead of him in the rankings.
All right, next Saturday night, we will have a 1-hour pre-fight show prior to the preliminary fights at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Tune in to Fight Network as the three of us will get you set for UFC 187.